Hello and welcome to this episode of the Oh Baby podcast. My name is Stephanie Poole. I'm a certified lactation consultant and doula and your host for today. And more than that, I'm super excited that you decided to join me for this episode. We are going to be walking you through how to make the decision whether or not breastfeeding is really right for you. We hear all of the hype. We hear all of the talk about breastfeeding. But we're going to get into how to make the decision if it's really right for you. So if you are pregnant and you are interested in breastfeeding, but you want a little bit more information, definitely stay tuned for this episode because by the end, you should be able to determine if it's really right for you and if it's something that you are really going to be aligned with to try with you and your baby. So definitely stay tuned for that. You guys know that I usually start the episode off with a segment called What Up Though? And if you're a return listener, you are familiar with this segment of the show. But if not, this is where I get to share a little bit of personal things that are not necessarily on topic for the episode. And hopefully in return, I can learn a little bit more about you. So if you hear something that resonates with you, you can always connect with me in my DMs over on Instagram at Birth Prep Academy. With that being said, today's topic in the segment What Up Though is going to be about me signing up for a half marathon. Y'all, I did a thing. And I haven't really spoken much about it, but it is something that I have been working towards over about the last month or so. And I still have a few more months of training to do before the actual race. So I'll definitely keep you posted with that. But I am learning so much about me. I'm learning a lot about my body, about what it takes to really set a goal and then show up consistently to try and achieve that goal. So even though it's a fitness goal or a health and wellness goal, it's teaching me so much more about just the different areas in my life, like here in my business, even more specifically with the podcast, just showing up consistent and the importance of that. It's teaching me that you don't just wake up one day and decide to run a half marathon. Like you doing so would seriously position you for injury. Bottom line, just injury and a lot of pain and suffering. But getting up every day, doing a little bit towards it every day really pushes you towards that goal. And then one day you look up and you really are conditioned and trained and ready to run that half mile. And that really is just teaching me a lot about what it takes to be successful in terms of really hitting your goals. And so I hope that you can pull little nuggets from that as well in terms of maybe a goal that you have. It might seem a little bit overwhelming to think about just reaching that goal full on day one, but taking it little by little and moving forward step by step is really the way to do it. And I hope that this encourages you to do it. If I can do it, you can do it. So I will definitely keep you posted on that progress. Currently, I am up to about 4 miles. Usually Saturdays are my long day, and I'll go out and do a long day with myself and my husband. And usually once we're done, we're both really tired, but we both feel very accomplished that we're doing something toward some goals that we have. Yeah, I'm excited. I'm nervous, but I am excited. And I will definitely keep you posted on that goal as the weeks and the months progress, even up until race day. So if you're interested in that, if you want to follow that journey, or how about you tap in and let me know maybe a goal that you're working on consistently over time so we can be accountability partners. I would absolutely love that. You can DM me over on Birth Prep Academy on Instagram. And I would like to just kind of check in and chat with you. You can follow my journey there as well. I'll be updating you here on the podcast too. Stay tuned and I'll let you know how it goes. All right. Without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this week's episode. Okay. So this week's episode is definitely one that I feel like all first-time moms should really take a good listen, right? When you're starting out and you're pregnant and you're trying to evaluate or take in information regarding you, regarding your baby, pregnancy, delivery, birth, postpartum, all those things, one of the things that is so important is whether or not you're going to breastfeed. Why? Because feeding and nurturing your baby with vital nutrition is mandatory. Without it, babies will not live. They won't thrive. And so it's a key part of taking care of your newborn after they're born. Having the information to determine, okay, I hear a lot about breastfeeding, but is it really right for me? That is what we're going to tackle today. That's what I'm going to jump into, give you some things to consider so that you can make an informed decision. I'm going to be honest and upfront. In the beginning of the episode, there's a disclaimer. I'm a lactation consultant. So obviously my opinion is, I'll be very forthcoming with my opinion in that I firmly believe that breastfeeding and breast milk is the optimal choice for human babies based on all of my training, all of the knowledge, everything that I've been privileged to have learned about in college and taught and trained on. There's nothing that stacks up to it. And I'm just going to put that out there up front. But that is my opinion. I am well aware as a human, as a mom, that, for whatever reasons, that may not be a viable choice for everyone. And so I feel like it's important for me to at least present the information and then allow you to make an informed decision based on where you are and what aligns with you and your lifestyle. So that's the purpose of this episode. And hopefully it will provide value for you to do just that, to be able to make an informed decision. Let me start out by just talking about what is breastfeeding. Why do we recommend it? So breastfeeding is simply the human milk that we produce starting at 4 months gestation. So when you are pregnant at about 4 months, your breast development starts to move into lactation mode, where those finishing touches are put on your anatomy to then be able to start producing milk. Breast milk is the optimal choice for human babies. That is just what it is. And I'll give you information that actually supports that. The reason why we say that it is the optimal choice is just simply because of how it functions and what it delivers to the baby. So when we talk about breastfeeding, what comes to mind initially is usually just like a feeding, right? To satisfy the baby's hunger. That is the purpose of formula, first and foremost. And that is one of the purposes of breast milk. So while breast milk does satisfy the hunger of your baby, it also has other purposes. It is also comprised of all these different things that have other goals, as well as feeding the baby. And so let's talk about some of those benefits. Breast milk is beneficial to both mom and the baby. And that's one of the points that makes it so unique, in that it's not just feeding the baby. It actually provides benefits for the baby, health benefits for the baby, and health benefits for mom. So we know that breastfeeding moms have a lower incidence of chronic illnesses after they have breastfed. What does that mean? What does that look like? That means lower incidence or risk factors for heart conditions, low risk factors or lower incidence of diabetes, lower incidence and risk factors for some cancers, all from breastfeeding. We know that based on research, it was noted that they had lower incidence of certain diseases, risk factors that occurred in other women. So that's the benefit for moms. For babies, and when I'm saying that's the benefit, that's what we have time to go into today. There's so much that breast milk does, but I like to try and hit on a lot of the high level points. This is definitely a conversation to be continued, but for babies, some of the benefits is not just to satisfy their hunger, but also to, we call it seed their gut microbiome. So this helps to seed and seal their gut. most of us have become aware, especially in the last few years, that your gut health is an indicator of your overall health. So people with good bacteria or probiotics in their gut tend to have overall better health than people who have poor gut health. People who have leaky gut and things like that tend to suffer from other chronic illnesses and diseases. And the same is true with your baby. So what we like to see is that the breastfed babies actually have a lining that is coated and sealed in their gut and their digestion with good microbiome bacteria. And so what that means is they have all of this good bacteria in their gut that helps to fight off antibodies. It has antivirus in it. So like your baby, when they're at the breast and they're feeding, can do a scan. And if your body detects that your baby is fighting off an illness, let's say like a cold, it will up the amount of antibodies in your next batch of milk so that the baby can get more antibodies to fight off the detected virus. So it has those components. It has certain hormones in it that helps to regulate the baby and different health benefits of that. There's just so much. Like I said, I don't want the whole episode to become about the benefits, but I like to try and hit some of those right off the top so that you can understand exactly the power of breast milk and what we're dealing with. So that is what breast milk is. We started again at about 4 months gestation. And those are some of the components, the benefits to actually breastfeeding a baby. And why is that important? Because we're talking today about, is breastfeeding right for you? And to me, whenever I'm explaining or coaching clients, patients in the hospital, it's important that they understand the why, because there is a learning curve to breastfeeding. It doesn't always start out smooth with no bumps in the road. It's very likely that you may hit a few bumps before you actually get into a rhythm and a groove. And when you're working through that, you need to have a why. Otherwise, you may not necessarily see the value in continuing forward this journey. So that's why I like to explain up front what some of the benefits are so that you can really assess why breastfeeding may be worth the actual work or the persistence, the consistency of keeping it going, what the benefit is. And we just talked about that. So now that we've gotten that out the way, let's move on to maybe some considerations that you should consider when you're thinking about if breastfeeding is right for you. So the first consideration I like to really talk to moms about is your lifestyle. On the go, maybe you have to go back to work after having the baby. If that is the case for you, how will breastfeeding look for you? What does that look like? Is this something that you feel like you'll be able to do? And it's important to understand, and I say this to so many of my moms, which is breastfeeding can take on whatever shape you need it to take on. Sometimes, and myself included, I was of the impression that breastfeeding was putting the baby to breast and and in reality, it can be comprised of a lot of different things. So what do I mean by that? Sometimes you might put the baby to breast. Sometimes you may pump. Sometimes you may pump more than putting the baby to breast. It depends on your lifestyle and what works for you. And some people, we use formula as a tool. We always support giving breast milk first because of all of its benefits. Also, it is easier to digest than formula. So we always try to give human milk first as the recommendation. But let's say for you and your lifestyle, supplementation is needed. And I think when people start to have that conversation, they are under the impression that means they have to automatically discontinue breastfeeding. And you do not. You can actually do a combination of both breastfeeding and formula supplementation. You can breastfeed and you can pump and supplement that way. Like it can literally take the shape of whatever you need based on your lifestyle and what breastfeeding looks like for you. And I think that having that understanding is so powerful because it gives you permission to keep going in whatever way feels right for you, essentially. So when I hear moms say there's no reason for me to breastfeed because I'm going to have to go back to work, we can usually figure out a plan if it's truly your goal to breastfeed. Here in the United States, which is where I am, most employers are required to offer breaks and to offer a private area for you to be able to pump your milk, and pumping before you go to work. And then depending on how long your shift is, doing a quick pump maybe while you're at work, and then being able to pump once you get home is usually sufficient. And so you really are doing one pump at work. Optimally, we like to try and get it to around that one pump. If you're doing a full 8-hour shift, if you're doing more than that, you may need to pump a little bit more, but ideally for an 8-hour shift, only one pump is needed. We have wearable pumps now that offer convenience. And also something to consider is that a pumping session really only needs to last. Optimally, we like to shoot for about 15 minutes, but if you can't do a full 15 minutes, even if you could do a minimum of a 10 minute, let's say you have a 10-minute break, you can still do a pump 10 minutes and it's enough to relieve pressure, to express milk, and to be able to move on with your shift, and then just do a full session before and after work. So we can always work out a plan to accommodate, but it is important to understand what your lifestyle looks like, set a goal, and then try to create a plan to really support your breastfeeding goals. So that's something that you need to consider. Also, another consideration would be your health and medical history. We need to assess what your health conditions are, and if you are on any medications, what that would look like. And if there's any medications being passed through the breast milk, how will that affect the baby? So we also need to assess. That is a consideration that you need to consider. The other consideration I would put out there is for your support, your level of support. And what I mean by that is for you to identify, especially in those early days, in the immediate postpartum, like where your support is going to come. That is so important. There's a research that was done in regards to moms who had support. Now, this particular research was done on spouses or the dads who were there to support breastfeeding moms. And what they found is that moms who had dad support them in their breastfeeding journey were like 3 times more likely to actually be successful at breastfeeding. Now, I think it's very powerful to have a couple that is supportive of one another in that way. But if your situation is that you don't necessarily have the spouse there for whatever reason, right? I think it's still important to identify at least 1 to 2 other people. Maybe it's a mom, maybe it's a sister, maybe it's a close friend or a coworker. But you need to identify someone who can be there to help support you, encourage you through those days and weeks in the immediate postpartum so that you can really be encouraged to keep going. Like I said, breastfeeding, one of my key sayings is breastfeeding is very simple. It's very simple because all you really need is you and baby. It's been going on since the beginning of time. But even though it's simple, it is not easy. There is a learning curve to breastfeeding. And so in those early days, while you're trying to get a rhythm, while you're trying to learn your baby's feeding cues, and you're trying to understand how to latch and really help the baby train in your feedings so that they know exactly how to get onto the breast and start drawing milk right away, that takes a learning curve. And in those early days, you can hit a patch if you have a baby that's really sleepy. So they're not latching. They're not opening wide. You really have to almost not force them to eat. We never want to force, but you really have to entice them to get on, to open wide, right? That could be a challenge. Or what if the baby has some kind of tongue tie or some other kind of issue where the latch hurts or is uncomfortable because of the way the baby is on the breast? There's a lot of things that could potentially cause what we call a bump in the road in that learning curve. And so having someone to really help you is going to be key. Now, when I say this, I'm immediately thinking of a particular couple that I was their doula at the birth. And the dad, I shared this information with him, shared the importance of the supportive spouse and how women are more likely to be successful at breastfeeding. And it literally panned out to be true in their case because he was a champion. He took that information and he just championed his wife in such an amazing way that when we talked about it later, the mom, the wife, was like, there were times when I was really ready to give up. I had a hard time latching the baby. He was much better at helping me get the baby on than I was by myself. And there were times when I was ready to give up. But because he was there to help encourage me, we were able to go a little bit further and she was able to meet her breastfeeding goals. And not only does that research ring true, but even in the case of my clients, those that have that support, it means so much in terms of your breastfeeding success. So please keep that in mind. In the beginning, I'm going over all of the benefits, right, of breastfeeding. And I think it would be irresponsible for me to mention all of these great benefits and not really tell you some of the challenges that needs or should be considered for you to be able to determine, is this something you want to do? And I feel like knowing up front is really half the battle. So number one, some of the challenges you may encounter is a physical soreness, right? On your nipples, with the baby really manipulating them and with the sucking and things like that. It is very common for them to be tender. And understanding that up front is important, because if you don't factor that in and then you start breastfeeding and you have these tender or sore nipples, then you can feel a little jaded. Wait a minute, I didn't know it was going to feel like this. So you should anticipate that there may be some kind of physical soreness or tenderness to the breast area, which is completely normal. Now, I'm not talking about any dried or cracked nipples at all, because you should not have dried or cracked nipples. If that's the case, you should definitely reach out to a lactation consultant. We can help you with latch and positioning, which in turn should help to correct the dry, cracked, bleeding nipple situation. I'm just talking about basic tenderness. So that is very common, and you need to position yourself that this is something that may occur, especially at the onset of breastfeeding, while your body is pretty much adjusting to this new form of feeding for you and for your baby. The second thing that may be a challenge is time and commitment. Babies, newborns typically eat between 8 to 10 times a day. Sometimes even more than that if they're going through a growth spurt. Now, most newborns eat around the clock anyway, whether it's formula or breast milk. So that's just something that you have to hunker down in when you think about newborn care. But for breastfeeding, what we like to say as lactation consultants is 8 or more in 24. So you need to stimulate your breasts at least 8 times in a 24-hour period. And that stimulation can come from either you putting your baby to breast, or simply by pumping. But that needs to happen a minimum of 8 times in order for you to establish and sustain a healthy and adequate milk supply for your baby. Let me say that again. You need to stimulate your breast a minimum of 8 times in a 24-hour period to establish and sustain healthy and adequate milk supply for your baby. Okay? So you need to be able to commit to that if breastfeeding is really important to you, and if it's something that you're considering, that needs to be taken into account. The last thing would just be the social and cultural aspects of breastfeeding, depending on where you live in the world, depending on what your culture or your religious background may be. You may be practicing modesty, and there's different levels to that. There's different forms to that. But in general, it wouldn't be necessarily acceptable for you to be exposed in public. And that's a consideration. Will you be able to provide some kind of light covering to cover yourself and the baby during a feeding? Or will you have access to maybe a private area that you could breastfeed in? So these are all things that you have to consider Another thing would be to pump before you go out in public so that maybe you can administer the breast milk with a bottle versus placing the baby to the breast. So these are all things that you have to consider when you talk about breastfeeding. That may be a challenge for you. It may not. Maybe you're totally okay with it and you don't have those particular barriers. But if so, this is something that needs to be considered when you think about, is breastfeeding right for me? In conclusion, there are multiple benefits to breastfeeding for both mom and the baby. It is not like formula. It is not an equal equivalent. Goal of breast milk is not just to satisfy the baby. The goal of breast milk is also to provide a healthy, supported immune system, to fight off viruses, to satisfy the hunger, to provide a healthy gut, balanced hormones. The list goes on and on. So it's a different component. It is not equal to formula. That's number one. There's benefits for both mom and baby. Health-wise, you should consider that. Also, consider things like your lifestyle, what breastfeeding looks like for you. If you practice modesty, what does that look like when you have to feed in public? Are you able to commit to stimulating your breast either through a feeding, placing the baby to breast, or pumping a minimum of 8 times a day in a 24-hour period? Is that something that you can commit to? The soreness, especially in those early days as your body is adjusting to this new way of feeding. These are all things that I want you to consider when you really take a look at breastfeeding. And again, it's my responsibility to be sure to have this conversation with you, because I think, unfortunately, so many people really like the idea of breastfeeding, but they don't really like exactly what that means. And that won't be you, because you now know what that means. And so when you sign on to actually breastfeed, you can sign on know that I'm going to have to stimulate the breast. I know that I'm going to have some slight tenderness here or there as my baby adjusts to this way of feeding. All of these things you will go into it knowing, which means, and here's the good part, that you are now positioned for breastfeeding success. When you go in with all those things in mind, it's hard for you not to be successful because you're so well prepared. So I hope ultimately that this is something that you consider. Like I said, I'm not bashful about my opinion because I am a lactation consultant and I know the benefits of breastfeeding your baby and what we see even down the road, years and years after the baby has finished breastfeeding. There are still benefits that we see in children. Their learning, their development, all of that is impacted by having a great start fundamentally. And so I hope you genuinely consider it. But now we've presented the information and now it's up to you. It's up to you to be able to make an informed choice based on your lifestyle and what feels closely aligned for you and for your baby. I hope this helps. I hope this helps. If you are interested in learning how to breastfeed, meaning the step-by-step instruction, there are 2 ways that you can learn from me. One is to book a one-on-one consultation where I essentially go over step by step so that you know exactly what to do once baby is born to jumpstart your breastfeeding journey. That's number 1. And I will leave the information in the show notes. Number 2 is to take my course, Teach Me How to Breastfeed, which is a digital course that walks you through it, right? And so you can visit both options below in the links. And yeah, I can't wait. I can't wait to help you get started. Until next time, happy